There are moments in history when the earth itself seems to hold its breath, when armies march, thrones tremble, and the roar of empires fills the air. Yet somewhere in the quiet a single whisper rises. That whisper is faith. It does not come dressed in armor. It carries no banners, no blades. And yet when it stands before the mightiest kings and conquerors, something strange happens. The thunder of power falters and the noise of the world grows still. For in that meeting, when faith met power, power fell silent. Not because it was defeated in battle, but because it met something it could not touch, could not buy, and could never understand. History remembers the wars and the crowns, but what it forgets is this. Behind every fallen empire stood a force unseen, a belief unbroken, a fire that refused to die. And that, my friends, is where this story begins. Let me tell you something about power. Power walks into the room loud. It wants to be seen, it wants to be feared. It's the man in gold armor, the general on a black horse, the ruler who leaves the world. The world bends because he wills it so. But faith walks in quiet. It doesn't need an army. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't even need to win right away. Because faith knows something power doesn't. It knows that storms come and go. But mountains, they stay. See, every empire that ever lived thought it would last forever. Every conqueror believed he could cage the soul of a people. But you can chain a man's hands, you can't chain his belief. You can burn the books, but not the truth written on hearts. You can silence the voices, but not the fire inside them. Faith doesn't fight like power does. Power swings swords, faith carries scars, power tries to dominate, faith dares to endure. Power says, "A bow to me." Faith says, "A break me, and I will still stand." You look through history. The mighty stood on thrones made of stone, while the faithful knelt on floors of dust. And yet when the dust settled, it was the throne that was empty and the faith that remained. Because faith doesn't need perfect circumstances, it creates them. It doesn't wait for a clear path. It walks through fire. It doesn't ask for permission, it makes history. There were moments when the world thought it had crushed the last believer, erased the last prophet, silenced the last voice that dared to speak truth. But then, in the ashes, something always rose again. When Pharaohs commanded the Israelites to stay in chains, faith said, "I let my people go." When Rome tried to silence a carpenter from Galilee, faith said, "He has risen." When empires tried to erase the name of hope, faith whispered it back into existence. Because power rules for a time, but faith rules forever. And I'm not talking about some soft, quiet belief you keep for comfort. I'm talking about the kind of faith that bleeds. The kind that stands when everything else falls. The kind that doesn't need a throne because it already sits in the heart. You see, power always underestimates that. It doesn't understand how a man with nothing can still stand taller than a king. It doesn't understand how a mother can pray for her child in a war zone and still believe in tomorrow. It doesn't understand how people can lose everything and still not lose themselves. That's what scares power. That's why it goes out. Because when faith walks in, the room changes. The noise fades, the threats lose their weight, the crown feels lighter. Power looks into the eyes of faith and sees something it can't control, something immortal, something unbreakable. And in that moment, it realizes the truth that no empire ever wants to hear. You can conquer lands. You can own wealth, you can command men, but you will never command the spirit. Faith has no borders, no chains, no master. It belongs to the eternal. And when it speaks, even the proudest kings listen. So remember this, when faith met power, power didn't die, it just learned its place. Because there is no force greater than belief held firm in the heart of the broken, no victory stronger than the will of those who refuse to kneel. And that, my friends, is how the world changes, not when power shouts, but when faith stands still. Power loves noise, it feeds on it. The clash of swords, the roar of crowds, the sound of fear echoing through marble halls. That's how power feels alive. But faith doesn't need the noise. Faith works in silence. Because silence, that's where the real strength lives. That's where the real strength lives. When you've lost everything, when the crowd walks away, when the applause fades and all that's left is the sound of your own heartbeat, that's when faith steps in. Not with thunder, not with lightning, but with a whisper that says to keep going. You see, power shouts to be heard. Faith whispers and still moves mountains. Power tries to command the world. Faith changes it. Think about it. The greatest revolutions in human history didn't start with soldiers. They started with someone refusing to give up. Someone on their knees in silence, believing in something no one else could see. That's the power of quiet conviction. When everything around you says a quit, faith says a stay. When fear says you can't, faith says a watch me. When the world closes doors, faith finds a window in the dark. And here's the truth. The silence of power isn't weakness. It's defeat. Because when power can't break the soul, it runs out of words. When oppression meets unshakable belief, it has nothing left to say. Picture this. An empire stands tall, swords in hand, soldiers in line, banners waving in the wind. Across from it stands one man, unarmed, unshaken, eyes lifted toward heaven. The empire laughs, but deep down it's afraid. Because that man carries something it can't understand. The courage to lose everything and still believe. Faith doesn't argue with power, it doesn't shout back. It simply endures. And that endurance, that quiet, relentless endurance is what breaks power's grip. You see, the world teaches us that victory is loud, but real victory, it's the moment you don't break. It's the moment you walk through fire and your spirit stays whole. That's what the tyrants never understood. They thought if they crushed the voice, the truth would die. But truth doesn't live in voices, it lives in hearts. They thought if they burned the scriptures, the message would fade. But the message was never ink on paper, it was fire in the soul. Faith isn't just belief, it's rebellion against despair, it's defiance in the face of darkness. It's saying, you can take everything from me, but you can't take what I am. And when faith says that, power goes silent. Because what can you threaten a man with when he's already found peace in something bigger than himself? What can you take from a woman who's already given her life to her cause? What can you scare the faithful with when they fear nothing but losing their purpose? That's the silence I'm talking about. Not the silence of defeat, but the silence of awe. The moment when the sword meets the spirit and realizes the spirit doesn't bleed. So if you ever find yourself standing against something bigger than you, remember this. You don't need to be loud to be strong. You don't need to be seen to make a difference. You just need faith that doesn't break no matter how loud the world gets. Because when the world's power fades, when the empires crumble and the crowns turn to dust, it won't be the roar of kings we remember. It'll be the silence of faith that outlasted them all. Let me take you back to the battlefield of human history. Not the one filled with swords and blood, but the one filled with hearts and fire. Because the greatest warriors this world ever knew didn't wear armor. They didn't hold weapons. They stood unarmed, yet undefeated. These were men and women who walked into the jaws of power with nothing but conviction. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and underestimated. But listen to me. They had something no army could ever carry. Belief. And belief, my friend, is heavier than steel. Think about those who stood before the might of empires. Prophets who faced kings and said no. Teachers who refused to bow to lies. Mothers who protected their children when the world gave up hope. Farmers, slaves, monks, wanderers, people with no title, no shield, no safety. But with faith so strong it burned through fear like sunlight through smoke. They didn't wait for a miracle. They became one. They became one. While power sat on its throne shouting orders, faith knelt in the dirt whispering prayers. And those whispers shook the earth. Because courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to keep standing when fear tries to bury you. Every empire that rose in arrogance met these people. Rome had them. Babylon had them. Every tyrant who believed he could rule forever had to face those who carried faith instead of fear. And every time, power trembled. Because how do you break someone who's not afraid to die? How do you silence someone whose truth lives beyond their voice? How do you conquer people who believe that the soul can't be chained? You can't. You just can't. They were tortured, but they didn't give in. They were thrown into prisons, but their words escaped the walls. They were burned, broken, mocked, but their light outlived the fire. Faith doesn't retreat. It doesn't surrender. It doesn't negotiate. It looks at power and says, you can destroy my body, but you'll never touch what's inside.
These are the legends nobody sings about in songs. The quiet rebels of the spirit. They didn't fight for fame or for gold.
They fought for truth, for freedom, for something eternal. And here's the secret. That's why they always win in the end. Because the greatest revolutions weren't won by swords. They were won by souls. The greatest empires weren't defeated by enemies. They were defeated by their own fear of the faithful. When power looked into the eyes of those unarmed men and women, it saw something terrifying. The reflection of its own weakness. Because faith doesn't flinch. It doesn't blink. It doesn't need approval. Those people, they carried light into darkness, hope into despair, love into hate, and that's what changed the world. Not their strength, but their refusal to stop believing when everything told them to quit. So if you ever feel small, if you ever feel like you've got nothing left, remember them. Remember the ones who stood with nothing and still changed everything. They didn't wait for the perfect time. They didn't ask for the perfect. And when they did, empires fell silent. Because faith carried by the humble and the broken has a sound that no power on earth can silence. The sound of hearts that refuse to bow. So don't ever say, I'm just one person. One person with faith has already changed the world over and over again. And if they could stand unarmed and still shake the heavens, then what's stopping you? That's the one battlefield every empire must face. Not the wars, not the rebellions, not the enemy's time. Because time doesn't care about crowns. It doesn't care about glory. It erases everything that isn't built to last. And if history teaches us one truth, it's this. Power fades. Faith endures. Every empire that once believed itself eternal, gone. Their banners torn, their statues crumbled. Their names carved into ruins the wind can barely remember. But faith is still here, still whispered in the dark, still written in the hearts of the broken. Still alive where no army could ever march. Power is loud but temporary. It's like thunder. It shakes the sky, then disappears. Faith is the mountain that still stands after the storm has passed. You see, time is the great equalizer. It humbles kings. It silences generals and erases borders. And yet it can't touch conviction. It can't destroy what's eternal. The Roman legions are gone. The pharaohs sleep in tombs of dust. The emperors who once ruled half the world, their palaces are empty shell. But the prayers of their slaves, the faith of their victims, the songs of their believers, those still echo. Because what is faith, if not the refusal to let time win? Faith doesn't age. It doesn't die. It keeps burning generation after generation, passed down like fire in the night. And that's the test every power fails. When the soldiers march home and the flags stop waving, faith is still working. When the speeches fade and the statues crumble, faith is still standing. When time whispers it's over, faith shouts back, and not yet. That's why power fears faith, not because of what it is, but because of what it becomes. Power lives for a season. Faith lives for eternity. And eternity doesn't bow to kings. Think about it. How many rulers spent their whole lives building monuments to themselves, trying to carve their names into stones so time wouldn't forget? But you know what people remember? Not the stone, not the gold, not the titles. They remember the ones who believed. The ones who stayed true when everything else fell apart. The ones who carried faith through fire. The ones who stood for something bigger than power itself. Because time only preserves what's real. And faith, real faith, is the most real thing this world has ever known. You can measure the rise and fall of nations in centuries, but you measure faith in eternity. It doesn't live in palaces. It lives in people. That doesn't depend on armies. It depends on hearts. And as long as there's breath in even one believer, power can never truly win. So when you see the world chasing control, chasing dominance, chasing the illusion of forever, remember this. They'll all fade. The lights, the titles, the noise, all of it. But faith will still be standing calm and unshaken when time runs out. Because power is a storm. Faith is the sunrise after it. And no matter how many storms rage through history, the light always returns. We live in a world that still worships power. Look around. People chasing money, fame, control, trying to build kingdoms out of likes and followers, thinking that status is strength. But let me tell you the truth. That kind of power is paper thin. It burns fast. It breaks easy. Because when life hits, when the storms come, when the lights go out, when the people cheering your name disappear, you'll find out real quick what you actually built your life on. And if it isn't faith, it won't stand. See, our age has forgotten something the ancients knew. Power rules the body, but faith commands the soul. You can lead armies, but you can't command belief. You can own wealth, but you can't buy peace. You can hold authority, but you can't manufacture purpose. Faith is the one thing power can't counterfeit. You can fake strength, but you can't fake conviction. You can pretend confidence, but you can't pretend hope when your world falls apart. And this generation, our generation, needs to remember that. Because we're building towers again. Towers of ego. Towers of pride. Towers of control. And every time humanity builds a tower high enough to touch the sky, it forgets who gave it the ground to stand on. That's when power gets loud and faith gets tested. But here's the thing, the test is always the same. Who will you be when everything you thought made you strong is gone? When the applause fades, when the title's stripped, when no one's watching? Will you still believe? Because that's where faith is forged. Not in comfort, but in chaos. Not in sunshine, but in the storm. Faith doesn't need proof to move. It doesn't need permission to rise. It doesn't need certainty to keep walking. When the world says, "Oh, you're done," faith says, "Watch me stand again." And that's the lesson. Power may win for a moment, but faith wins for eternity. Because faith isn't about controlling the world. It's about not letting the world control you. You want real power. The kind that doesn't fade, doesn't bend, doesn't break. Then learn to believe when belief makes no sense. Learn to keep walking when the road disappears. Learn to forgive when hate feels easier. Learn to trust when fear tells you to run. That's power, real power. The kind that no government can take, no tyrant can crush, no failure can destroy. Because when faith stands up, everything else sits down. When faith speaks, even power listens. When faith moves, the world changes. And we need that now more than ever. Not louder voices, not stronger armies, not richer men. We need faith that doesn't quit. Faith that burns through darkness. Faith that makes power remember its place. Because when faith met power, power fell silent, and it always will. So stand up. Not with arrogance, not with pride, but with belief. Belief that the unseen is greater than the visible, that truth is stronger than fear. That your purpose, your faith, your fire will outlast every throne, every empire, every name carved in stone. Because the final word of history will not be power, it will be faith.